Can the religious actually answer questions in any credible, evidence-based way? Well, yeah, of course not. What a silly question that is. Yet, we're going to let Josh Rasmussen give it a shot one more time, even though he's destined to fail. Why? Because he's not at all concerned with the real world, of course. What the hell else is new? We're back today for the last installment of Josh Rasmussen's 4-part video series on the problem of evil, even though he never really addresses the problem of evil. Okay, fine, whatever. Yet, he never really makes any decent points either, as I think this final video will show. It's just, what if? Followed by a whole bunch of religiously confirming conclusions that don't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny whatsoever. Because, who cares about that, right? Certainly not the religious. So, let's get this over with.
What sort of world could contain evil?
The real one? Now, keep in mind, evil exists only because intelligent minds exist. Evil has no objective existence at all outside of our heads. We only see it that way because we came up with the concept ourselves. Ultimately, evil is just the things that we really don't like compared to things that we'd prefer. What one person considers evil, other people might think are just fine. It's all purely subjective. But that's not something that the religious tend to favor, is it?
In this video, I will show how evil may actually be evidence of a world with a good foundation. To begin, imagine you have some dirt in your hand. Here's a challenge. Try to make this dirt evil. How might you do that?
I don't know. Maybe if you threw it off an overpass onto cars passing below until they'd all crash and burn and everybody would die because they couldn't see. Granted, most people would think that would be you that was evil since you did all the work. But what about a storm? If a storm blew up a bunch of dirt and dust and things like that, and the same thing happened, would anybody say that the storm was evil? Probably not. Like I said, this is all entirely subjective. Evil doesn't actually exist in the real world. You need to get that through your head.
How could you convert dirt into something evil? You could smash the dirt, spread it out, compact it, but none of these actions would make the dirt evil. To understand how to make evil, we must understand what evil is. What is evil?
Well, if you want to go with, say, a dictionary definition, it's profound immorality and wickedness, especially when regarded as a supernatural force. And that makes God evil if you look at a lot of the things that the Bible claims that he did. However, none of that even exists in reality, so I'm not really seeing the point here. It's all just subjective, as I said. If we really don't like something, we simply declare it evil. And that's certainly not consistent because different people declare different things to be evil. What some people consider evil, others will consider good, and others will consider entirely neutral. It doesn't matter, it's all subjective. So I'm really not sure what point Josh is trying to get to, but let's let him try to explain it, shall we?
Here's a hypothesis. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. For example, genocide is evil because people ought to be safe.
And exactly what asshole did you pull that one out of? Your wishes don't accurately describe reality. People don't deserve anything. There is no ought here at all. There is only reality, and your feelings don't remotely enter into it. Because this is really where things tend to go sideways with the religious. They only care about their feelings. They can't see anything except through that particular lens. And whether they like it or not, that lens is stupid. Sorry to say that to you people, but it is. When people fall off a boat and drown, that's not evil. That's physics. Crap happens. We may not like it, but who the hell says we get to dictate reality based on our fifis? All right, the religious do that. Well, sorry, but that's just stupid.
Notice that the way things ought to be is not always the same as the way things are. For example, if your bones are broken, that's how they are, not how they ought to be.
Except you're just asserting that difference. You can't actually demonstrate it. What you're really saying here, Josh, is that things aren't the way that you want them to be. Not ought, want. There's a difference. But the religious can't seem to figure that out, can they? They value their desires over their grasp on the real world, and that's kind of a problem, isn't it? Not that you'll ever get them to admit it or anything, but it remains a problem nonetheless.
This observation supports our hypothesis. Evil occurs when the way things are departs from the way they ought to be. On this account, to make evil out of dirt, there must first be a way things ought to be. Let us call the way things ought to be the moral standard.
Sure, as long as you're just making stuff up, why not? Because this is the religious, telling themselves stories because fifis. Is it any wonder that the skeptical and rational don't take any of this crap seriously? This is just the religious defining their happiness into reality by explaining how they really wish the world would be, slapping a label on it and just calling it good, and anything that violates that imaginary natural order, well, that just becomes evil. But like I said before, that's just stupid, isn't it? Well, yes. Yes, it is.
To make evil, then, we need a moral standard. But how do we get a moral standard? Can we make a moral standard out of dirt?
No, but we can't just make one up either, which is exactly what people have been doing since day one. Now, Josh, he's not going to like that. He's going to insist that his imaginary friend is necessary because that's what Josh wants to believe. But Josh isn't remotely concerned with what actually happens in the real world, is he? Again, he only cares about his fifis and never ever about the actual facts. And this is why they start with a belief in a god, and then they just backfill in all of the bald rationalizations that they need to make it seem like it fits, even though it really doesn't. Every other religion is doing the exact same thing, just with different gods and different rationalizations, but it all ultimately leads to the exact same place. Futility. Utter futility and complete fantasy. But, as we all know, they're really not that concerned, are they?
Here are 3 reasons to think not. First, arrangements of dirt are arrangements of the way things are, or could be, which is not the same as a standard for how things ought to be.
What makes you think there is an ought? This brings us right back to David Hume's is-ought problem, where Hume recognizes that the religious propose that there ought to be an ought rather than a recognition of what actually is. The religious are looking for a preferred state of affairs, but that doesn't mean that there is one. No matter how much you might really want things to be a certain way, that doesn't actually mean anything. Things are what they are. Your demand that they should be something else is completely meaningless. Yet the religious persist out of emotional comfort, not out of a recognition of the actual facts. Because to them, the facts just don't mean anything.
Second, producing a moral standard from dirt seems to be a category mistake, like producing prime numbers from prime ministers. The creation of a moral standard requires a categorical shift from non-moral to moral.
Well, you're the one that brought up dirt in the first place, remember? If you have a problem with the idea, blame yourself. Now, this assumes that there's any such thing as moral beyond the human mind in the first place, something that no theist has ever demonstrated, and as far as I can tell, it simply isn't demonstrable. Nobody is saying that you can get a moral standard from dirt but you, and that sounds distinctly like a Josh problem to me.
And it is not clear how any mere change in arrangement of dirt could account for such a categorical shift. Third, the moral standard seems to hold of necessity. For example, it seems to be a necessary truth that slaughtering innocent people is a departure from the way things ought to be.
Says who? Because that's exactly how things have worked throughout history, whether you like it or not. But that's really what all of this happens to be about. Josh's feelings. It doesn't appeal to him on an emotional level, and therefore, well, it just can't possibly be true. Yeah, except it is. I don't care what you like. It is. We're just not special. We're just animals. Killing each other is kind of what we do, and what we will always do on some level. It doesn't matter what veneer of civility you drape over humanity. We will always find excuses to kill each other if we can justify it. And keep in mind, those justifications, they're purely subjective too, just like morality. But that doesn't make me happy. Well, too bad. Welcome to the real world. Stick around and try to learn something. It really isn't that hard.
Configurations of dirt, by contrast, are merely contingent. No dirt holds its place of necessity. But if we can't use dirt to produce a moral standard, then what can we use? Marbles? Cheese? Protons? Maybe we could use brain states.
Which is the actual answer, but I think we all know he'll reject it in a second because he's got something else in mind. You know, that emotionally comforting belief that he holds to for absolutely no good, valid, or evidentially supported reason. I keep saying this, but I think it's important to note that once you're aware of how the religious think in air quotes of course, it's really hard not to see the irrational thought patterns that go into their blind faith. They don't believe because they have a good reason. They believe because they want to. And Josh here, he is absolutely no different. He is the unfortunate low-hanging fruit that I'm really trying to get away from. I want people who can come to religious conclusions without relying on their childish fifis. Why is it that I can't find any of those? Can anybody out there please explain? I'd really like to know.
Unfortunately, all contingent materials, whatever their ingredients, have the same deficiency. None are a necessary standard of the way things ought to be.
You mean that thing that you're just asserting but can't actually prove exists? Yeah, that thing. Because this is where the religious completely fall apart. They are looking for perfection in a universe that is inherently imperfect, at least from their point of view. There's no such thing as perfect. Perfect is a concept. It isn't a part of reality. They really want to feel special, even though they're not. They want to be loved unconditionally, even though that's really an absurd thing to desire. They want to be protected in an uncaring world that doesn't give a damn whether they live or die, nor even has the capacity to do so. The religious are just immature little children who don't comprehend the reality that surrounds them. And that makes them invent things out of whole cloth because it makes them happy. And that's just dumb. There is something really, really wrong with these people upstairs. We can all see it. Why the hell can't they?
The moral standard, if there is such a thing, must already exist prior to all contingent things.
Now, just a quick note here, because he says, if one exists, and then immediately assumes that one does without demonstrating it in any way, shape, or form. This is the classic misunderstanding of the difference between if and because. Even the supposedly educated fall for it. Sad, isn't it?
Otherwise, departures from the way things ought to be could never come to exist anywhere. These observations inspire the following argument for a perfectly good foundation. Premise 1. Evil exists.
Wrong. Now, we do think that evil exists, we just arbitrarily label things that we don't like as evil. There just isn't an objective demonstration of evil. You just lost, Josh. This really isn't that hard.
Premise 2. If evil exists, then it is possible for evil to exist. Therefore, it is possible for evil to exist.
Which is a completely nonsensical statement. If evil exists, which it doesn't, at least in the objective sense, but for the sake of argument, we'll go with it. But if evil exists, then evil exists. There is no possibly involved. This is just basic logic. A equals A. If you're alive, you're not possibly alive, you're alive. That's just the way that it works, Josh.
Premise 3. If the foundation of all things is perfectly good, then its perfect goodness provides a moral standard without which evil would be impossible.
There's that if again. You haven't actually shown that there is a foundation. You're just leaping to that conclusion without any demonstration whatsoever. You just really want it to be true, but that doesn't mean that it is true. And this is the fundamental failure in all theology. Your wishes and your dreams don't matter when it comes to objective reality. Your ifs don't become becauses simply because you wish that they did. He's just smuggling in all of his theology without verifying that his theology actually means anything. Josh is just compounding his failures. What the hell else is new?
Premise 4. If there is not a perfectly good foundation, then there is no guarantee of any moral standard that would make evil possible.
That's probably about as close as he's gotten to making sense so far, sadly. There's really no evidence for any foundation, period, beyond human desire. Evil is a purely subjective idea. There are no objective moral standards, period, because there are no objective morals. It's just a load of wishful thinking and emotional desires. Of course, he'll reject this out of hand because he just doesn't want it to be true. But so what? It doesn't matter what you want. What you want doesn't mean anything. Reality is what reality is, whether that makes you happy or not. Josh, get the hell over yourself.
Conclusion. The possibility of evil supports, that is, makes more probable, the perfect foundation theory.
It does absolutely nothing of the sort. Every single premise, with possibly one exception, was completely faulty. This is what happens when you let the religious fast talking run around with the goalposts. It's also why they're not out there talking to the skeptics. All of Josh's videos are made for people who already accept his base assumptions. He can't possibly demonstrate any of them, so he just talks to people who already think that they're true. And this is how to get absolutely nowhere in any kind of rational discussion. You don't have any rational discussions. You just preach to the choir, which is really all that Josh is doing here.
This follows from premises 3 and 4, together with the Bayesian analysis of conditional expectations. This argument has several interesting features. First, it is compatible with a wide range of secular moral theories, including contractarianism, moral Platonism, consequentialism, and various constructivisms. All these theories include a moral standard, and a good foundation would contain that standard within its nature.
Yeah, except it doesn't. Josh is trying to get to a God without mentioning a God, let's be honest. And all secular moral theories, except that humans are the moral standard bearer, not some imaginary man in the sky. Most secular moral theories begin with picking a subjective standard and then trying to apply objectivity to that standard moving forward. I don't think that works very well, but this really isn't the place to go into it. So no, Josh, I don't buy it, sorry. Every premise you have is terminally flawed. Go back to the drawing board and come back with something better.
Second, the argument has modest premises. I did not say that evil is guaranteed to be impossible without a perfectly good foundation. Rather, the argument is that a perfectly good foundation guarantees a moral framework, while its negation does not. That's enough to get support for the theory.
No, absolutely none of that is true. the whole thing really falls apart at the first premise, something that I reject entirely in the sense that he intends it, and it continues to crumble as he goes on. I think he foresees people having issues with his formulation, and he's just trying to shore it up, but there's really nothing of substance there worth looking at in the first place. This is true of just about everything the religious do. It's true of all of their ideas. They're based on an emotionally comforting conclusion that they've already come to because it satisfies their feelings, then trying to backfill in ideas that seem to support that conclusion without being independently defensible on their own. And this just doesn't work, Josh. I don't care what you feel.
Third, the argument gives us a bonus result. The perfect foundation theory not only predicts the possibility of evil, but it also predicts the likely existence of moral agents who can apprehend a moral standard. That's because a perfectly good foundation would have powers and purposes, and could thus cause reality to evolve in precisely the right ways required for the emergence of morally valuable communities.
And he keeps on smuggling in his theology, if you notice. Being a morally perfect being, if such a thing existed, would not necessarily have any powers or purposes whatsoever. This is just saying God without saying God. And that's what he's talking about here, because that's what his intended audience expects him to be talking about. The idea that we can't see that loud and clear is really absurd. We can see it, Josh. It's very obvious. You don't have to play make-believe. But this isn't just a Josh problem. This happens beyond the religious scope. I mean, just look at New Age idiots and essential oil scams. They'll speak in what is effectively code so that it doesn't sound quite so ridiculous to outsiders, but to all the gullible bobbleheads in the audience, they're all going, because they know what it's supposed to mean. I don't know if people like Josh are just too stupid and they just don't know that the skeptics are going to see right through all of it or what, but this isn't impressing anybody.
A merely abstract, uninstantiated form of the good, by contrast, lacks this additional predictive power.
There is no predictive power except in your head. You've got a goal in mind, a goal that can't be demonstrated to be reasonable or rational to begin with. It just makes you feel good to think that any of this is true, and that's not a good reason to think that any of this is true. Because, Josh, here's something that you need to understand. Truth is all that really matters. Your feelings are completely meaningless. I'm looking at what is actually so in the real world that we all share to the best of our ability to determine it, and none of this is getting you anywhere fast. And, yeah, that describes religion to a T, doesn't it?
Fourth and finally, the argument can put the trials in your life into a larger context. If you have reason to think the foundation of all things is good, then you may also have reason to think that the same foundation aims to make things, including bad things, work together for good.
And why in the world would you think that? Well, because it coddles your childish fifis, of course. Really, Josh, listen to yourself and realize just how dumb this all is. But I really want it to be true. Big deal. That is not how reality works. But I really want to fly like Superman. Yeah, who cares? You're not going to because that's stupid. Deal with it. Part of becoming an adult is learning to deal with the world as it actually is, not as you desperately might wish that it could be. It's coming to grips with reality. It's not living in the fantasy world in your head. Why don't you give that a shot, Josh? It can only help. This is really the problem that I have with the religious, and I think they've been doing it for so long that they're completely blinded to it. They just don't care anymore if they ever did. It's all about their fifis and never, ever about the facts. But in the real world, the facts are actually important, and your feelings simply aren't. Josh never really attempted to address the problem of evil in any of these videos. He just went, well, what if? And then assumed that his what if was what was actually going on. If that's supposed to impress anybody, it certainly didn't impress me, and I hope it didn't impress you either. He's just another one of the ridiculously low-hanging fruit who hasn't actually come to any rational conclusions, because rational conclusions, they aren't emotionally comforting, are they? He just wants it to be true, and he's aiming his videos at other people who also want it to be true, because why the hell not? It's easy that way. You don't actually have to do anything. Yet that's a really stupid reason to actually believe anything, right? The only reason to take a positive position on any claim is when sufficient rational, credible, and demonstrable evidence has been presented, and not 1 second before. And that doesn't seem to matter much to the religious or any of the other gullible fools out there because, as I keep saying, they just don't care. So long as it strokes their egos and gives them the dopamine shot to the head that they're looking for, they'll go with it because childish fifis. Seriously, can't we stop doing that? It's time for the planet to grow the hell up and deal with the reality that exists. Because we've had plenty of the other kind and it hasn't worked out so well. So, reality. Try it. It's not that hard. Stop being a dumbass.
Bum